Good afternoon from me. My name is Christi Kruger. I'm the Senior Research Manager at the Centre for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender based at the University of Pretoria. And I'll be moderating this panel entitled Gender Equity in the Workplace, Pitfalls and Unintended Consequences. I am joined this afternoon by two fantastic panelists. I have with me Nene Molefi. Nene is the founder and CEO of Mandate Molefi, where she facilitates conversations with executive management and staff to create conversations around diversity. She's also the board member of the Center for Global Inclusion, and she has expertise in working with multinationals and virtual teams based everywhere in the world. She also partners with many national and multinational organizations, and she has experience in combining local, complex South African dynamics, global challenges, and regularly speaks at conferences around the globe. She has also contributed to the development of the Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmarks, which provide guidelines and benchmarks for diversity and inclusion across centers. I am also joined this afternoon by Gavin Krugel, who some of us have seen today already at the summit. Gavin is the co-founder and CEO of Digital Frontiers. He was one of the early pioneers in mobile payments and has used that experience to venture into the development sector to focus on the use of technology to disrupt the status quo in financial services, healthcare, and education. He's also the chairman of Troy Taylor, executive director at the Digital Frontiers Institute, and a non-executive director at Diaspo. He has a master's degree in global business management at the Grenoble École de Management in France, and he's also a certified gender equality change maker. Welcome to you both. I'm looking forward to a fantastic conversation this afternoon. As some of our audience members may know, in 2021, Digital Frontiers branched out and launched with the Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender, an exciting new gender journey to establish gender equality change makers across the African continent. And this afternoon, springing from that experience, we are specifically going to focus on what gender equity in the workplace means in terms of those unintended consequences, albeit good or bad, that might pop up as a result of implementing gender change gender change initiatives within the workplace. So to kick us off, I am going to ask both Nene and Gavin to just speak to this topic briefly, after which we will continue the conversations. Later on, we will also give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. So please, as you listen, get those questions ready. I'm going to start off with Nene and ask you, Nene, if you could briefly, in about 10 or so minutes, just share with us some of your experiences in terms of the pitfalls and those unintended consequences of working with change within the workplace.
Thank you, Christi and everybody. Let me say hello, not good afternoon, because we are from all over the different parts of the world. I'm so glad to be here to share some of my experiences. I think, I would like to start with what I observe often when I deal with either gender equity or diversity broadly, is that what I see often is that there are three journeys that organizations often take. And the first journey is what I would call management fed, like you find a leader that says, wow, diversity is good, let's do it. And, a whole hyped way of saying, let's go for it. And then the second journey that I often see is that of a burning platform, an organization that does this work because there's something pinching them, or because there's an exodus of women from the organization, or there's some unhappiness. So let's do it. It's a kind of a panicky way. The third one, which I prefer, is what I would call the rallying cry, where a leader will take the organization through this journey because they believe in it, and they are being proactive, and they are leading from the front. They are more convicted about this as opposed to just doing it because somebody else is doing it. And why is this important for me? Is that if I use an example of how these manifest themselves. Let's say you go with the model that I often propose of the head, heart, and hands, where at the head level, you find a leader going through the motions of this is what we want to do, this is what we want to do, which is good. But then you stop there at the head. The heart actually says, fine, this is what you said we're going to do. How do we live it? What is the culture? What is the experience that people have? Because when you then get to the hands, you are better able to implement strategies that are sustainable because you've engaged the head, internalized it at the heart, and implementing it at the hand. So you need to ask yourself, what do we want to do? Why do we want to do it? What are we going to do with the results? I want to use one example in the space of gender equity. Let's say an organization is looking to correct their pay equity, right? And what I've seen, which is some of the pitfalls when there's lack of proper planning. So you don't ask yourself, and if it's Jenny 1 or 2, which is a management fed, or you're doing it because there's a banning platform, everybody's talking about pay gap, doing this. If you fall in that category, here are the pitfalls. You don't ask yourself, have we agreed the methodology? Will this be done internally, this pay gap analysis or audit, internally or externally? What's your differential tolerance level? For example, one standard deviation from the mean is acceptable. You can't get 100% equity, but I find organizations just going in because they're in a hurry without really properly planning. And do you have the budget to address the inequity that you find after you do the audit? And will you tackle those differences immediately or in a staggered approach? Will you tell employees what you have found in the audit? And will you give the feedback of the results? So I find that sometimes you catch yourself in the middle of it where there's a lot of pushback. Some of the pushback, for example, you've done an audit and employees want to say, okay, what did you find? And you hear people say, no, we can't really communicate the result. This is sensitive. This is, we can't really say this. But when you've announced, if it was a management fed or it was a banning platform, you've announced that we are going through this audit. There was no proper planning. So when people expect then the results, or you've conducted your audit and they're saying, okay, when are you going to fix it? Because this is what you have found. And I just find for me that the lack of proper planning becomes one of the biggest impediments of this, and it erodes trust from employees because they feel that, oh, it was just talk, right? And for example, when you find that there's this inequity, what are you going to say? When you correct it, there is, for example, part of your employees that are going to be remunerated less because you are correcting those who were underpaid. And if you don't want to face those conversations openly, then the trust is eroded. So the second one where I see that there's some kind of unintended consequences of something that was meant well. For example, if we use sexual harassment as another area of saying, let's focus on issues of gender equity or whatever the focus groups have told us. And you're not ensuring that those people who need to be dealing or handling those cases, first of all, have they themselves been trained on microaggressions, on how they treat, on the fairness in which they come across when they have to be dealing with these cases? And I find these things you might think, but this is obvious. But it's amazing how people skip that part, that whoever is chairing those proceedings. And the most important thing along the way, how and what are we doing to bring men along in this journey as well? You know, there's an organization that I've started, a small one with young boys, which is called the Boy Child Project. You know, when I listen to them, is that we are expecting grown men to understand all that around gender-based violence, but we are not starting early enough to say, are we engaging the young boys? Are we engaging young men to challenge them, to say, when you get to that pyramid of violence that we talk about, that it starts with things like microaggressions, it starts with normalizing a certain language. So I just find that we are very flippant. Organizations don't focus on that. They just think that suddenly people will be trained and they'll exactly know what they need to do. So and then the last point before my 10 minutes, the last point that I need to also mention around the unintended consequences is what I call internalization of negative messages. Let me give you an example. I'll be busy facilitating a workshop, a dialogue, and then you'll hear this comment from a woman. You'll hear a comment that says, now you're making the workplace too rigid. And you say, we can't say this, we can't do this, just, you know. And it's so difficult when you are getting that challenge from the people who are expecting to be allies of this journey. So sometimes we have adopted and we have bought the story that we, you know, if I've experienced a lot of discrimination over the years, I'm now handing it over and doing the same to people or even those who report to me. So I find the area we are not really addressing is that the extent of how oppression has been internalized as well. The mind, you know, Steve Biko talks about that the greatest weapon in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. That if I'm the one who's been experiencing this, and then I get used to it and I do it to others as well. So while we are fixing the whole thing of creating gender equity, we also need to say, how do I hold up the mirror? If I'm a leader, if I'm a woman, how do I hold up the mirror and not do the same for those who report to me? Those are just some of the things that I'm observing in the workplace.
Thank you so much, Nene. And I wish we had the time and space on this platform to take each of those points and do a whole session around each of them, because I have so many thoughts, and I'm sure our audience do as well. However, I'm going to hand over to Gavin and ask you to do the same, Gav, to briefly speak to this idea of gender equity in the workplace, some of the pitfalls, unintended consequences from your own experience.
Sure. And Nene, just a yes and. So a lot of my points reaffirm that we have to start with proper planning, that we do need to bring everyone along, especially men, that part of the challenge is we've all bought a story, right? And this internalization. And so maybe let me just expand on my experiences using that same thing. And thank you, Christi. Gender is part of the pitfalls is understanding, what are the real issues? What are the real issues, and taking the time to understand what the real issues are. So for me, gender is way more than what we are assigned at birth. It constitutes more than biological sex. And I strongly feel that a gender identity goes beyond the binary and non-binary constructs we have available to us and intersects with sexuality to form gender identities. We're just discovering the breadth of gender identity while working towards solving for truly inclusive gender equality in our organizations. Right? So there's this massive amount of exploration and learning that we're doing even outside of the organization that we now need to apply into organizations. Gender inequality is driven by socialization, exacerbated by intersectionality, and reinforced through time-long learned behaviors, reinforced subconsciously to form with other deep learned oppressions, what's referred to as deep structure. That's that internalization Nene was referring to. Things that feel natural, but shouldn't, right? That's the internalization. And so how do we, the pitfall is, how do we unwind something that feels natural, but shouldn't? How society defines the norms and behaviors of any specific gender leaves us needing to conform to stereotypes to fit in. And deviation from those stereotypes opens us up to even more inequality in the workplace and in society. This socialization plays out in the workplace and is seen in the organizational culture itself through social norms, gender dynamics, social and workplace roles, status, rank, and resulting power and gender stereotypes. So there, the story, Nene, that you were referring to is exactly that. We bought a story that defines, that places us in an environment with social norms that says that bought story is okay, right? Where it's not. Overlapping oppressions add weight to gender inequality in the workplace when issues of race, ethnicity, sexuality, upbringing, and standing in society are added to gender inequality. This intersectionality means that gender equality at the work or in society is not possible without considering overall equality, right? That's the planning, the discovery, right, that we need to do in order to even just start this work. I enjoyed what you said there, Nene, not just jumping in at the first opportunity so we can tick a corporate KPI block, but really taking our time to understand what's there. Patriarchy, in my view, is the deep structure result of gender and intersectional inequality. And that's what's impacting our culture, gender, and openness about true gender identities in the workplace. Gender-based discrimination is alive in the deep structure of organization and mirrors inequalities in society. So where you were talking again about sexual harassment, how do we bring that up in complex and sensitive environments? This leaves us with unequal gendered policies. All of this does. And practices and gender dynamics that force women and non-binary to fit with the norm at the cost of their own opportunities in the organization and their own economic empowerment. Addressing issues of inequality in the workplace must start with a deep reflection of an organization's culture, deep structured gender issues, and then defining what the organization's inclusive culture should look like in future. Again, back to that planning. Addressing gender equality must also start with expanding ideas and solutions from the narrow lenses of equal opportunity to reparation through empowerment, lifting up and prioritizing those discriminated against, equity over equality. So a lot, Nene, of yes and. Christi, let me stop there and pass it back to you.
Thanks, Gavin. I guess that's one of the pitfalls of being the second person to speak, is that if both people are really on top of it and have the same views that you often echo. But I so agree so much of what you both have said. I think what I've heard and what has especially stood out for me perhaps is the idea of time, that we need planning, we need to take time to do this and not just jump in without consequence. I especially like, Nene, what you said about budget, because that is often what we hear. People jump in very committed, and as soon as they realize budget is needed, leaders are less enthusiastic about doing this. And then also about the idea of taking the time to undo oppression and internalize stereotypes, right? This idea that we often have women pushing back, non-binary people, queer people, and thinking about how we undo what we bring to the workplace. I would like to invite anyone in the audience, if you would like to ask a question, please pop it in the chat there so that we can get to those in a minute. While we wait on the audience, I have a question, Solong. So Gav, I'm going to start with you because you were the last speaker. And I wondered if you, who so proudly is one of our first graduates as a gender change maker, if you could go back to yourself before starting on this journey of bringing change and gender equity to the workplace, what would be the one piece of advice you gave to yourself? This could be in your case, or it could be that you, in your particular experience, didn't encounter any particularly bad pitfalls, but sort of what is it that you would tell yourself about the journey that lies ahead?
Sure. It helps being the CEO, right? It helps being a co-founder. It helps being the head, right? To avoid the pitfalls, right? And I love, Nene's 3 journeys, because I can feel them in our own organization. We have a head that's leading us, and this is me. We have a burning platform. It is coming from the heart, and we do have a rallying cry. We have an increasing number of hands that that are working from it. So, you know, those three journeys I can see in varying degrees living in our organizations. You know, I definitely would have liked to have gone back and given, or the ability to go back and give myself advice. It would be to abandon assumptions of the root causes of inequity, right? I thought I understood them, and my understanding was bias. It was ill-informed, and it was a deep state problem in itself, right? I'm glad I've had my mind changed through my work in gender equity and through this work. And to say that it was a complete, you know, mind blown, let alone mind changed, is what Christi and the team will attest to, is that I even almost pulled the brakes on the program to say, hold on, what you're teaching is not the truth. It's not the truth, it's not fact, right? So prove to me that what you're teaching is actually true and factual. And they did that. And in doing so, it was just, you know, incredible for me to recognize just how my own deep structural, deep state, influenced by, you know, generations even before me, had a preconceived and ill preconceived idea of what the root causes were. So my, you know, my advice would, to myself and to anyone that's embarking on gender equality change work, is to park your assumptions, park them, you know, almost try and, you know, Men in Black yourself, nuke your mind and start afresh and learn and listen to what the causes are.
Thanks, Gavin. And I think that's such a powerful sort of testimony, right, to what this process could look like, how to avoid pitfalls, as you said, by getting leadership on board. How much easier it is if you have your CEO, you have your upper management, your C-suite on board in doing this, in really going for gender change. So before I further abuse my power as the moderator, there's a question to Nene from Pia, who asks, how do you balance the tension between making a process open and participatory and the need to keep it sharp and focused and results driven? Because he says sometimes when a process is very participatory, it is possible that it can become quite drawn out and even lose momentum if you take too much time to have it open.
I definitely understand what Pierre is saying. And what I've observed is that there are certain structures that employees prefer clarity. And when like leaders say, this is what we are going to do, this is what our intention, if you have a vision for what you're doing, that, for example, I always say organizations should either have DEI forums, diversity, equity, and inclusion forums, or employee resource groups, whatever. People have different structures. But why a structure is important is that an organization that employs 15,000, 20,000 people, there is no way you're going to consult with all the people. So if you invest time in putting together a structure like a DEI forum and give it teeth, I want to underline, give it teeth, so that when they bite, people would know that they have the endorsement and the support of the leadership, because you can use the DEI, they will be representing different stakeholders in your organization to be the voices of bringing the views of everybody into the table. The problem becomes when you have forums like this and then nobody takes them seriously, you know, and they're never even up for the time to meet. So I've seen that if you put in place structures and you support the structures and allow the structures to also guide you as the leadership, you don't have to be in a participatory process forever and ever, because once you have clearly your terms of reference, this is what we want to do, this is how we want to do it, this is the structure that's going to help us, I find that that actually works better.
Apologies, I was muted and speaking to myself there for a moment. Thank you so much, Nene. And I think there's something very interesting about these two last points that we heard from you and Gavin around structure and the necessity for structure, but also about leaving bias behind, right? So for me, perhaps that means having structure in place, as you said, giving teeth to forums to organizations or committees, but also not to pre-impose bias and structure it according to what you believe.
Can I also just comment on one thing that I like that Gavin mentioned around listening? You know, let me give you an example more from an African culture. One of my participants in the workshop, we often talk about when you want to raise issues of equity, whether it's on gender or race or whatever, you know, LGBTQI, you need to be brave and say it. Do you know that if you underestimate the concept of psychological safety, that it is not the same across people, that what comes to mind is not, it was about 3 or so weeks ago, one of my workshop participants said, you know what, I grew up in rural South Africa, in the rural areas, and I grew up being taught that I need to have deference for the elderly. I think if you look at the African culture and the Afrikaans culture in particular, those two, for me, there's some similarities that you can't get to the workplace and just call me if I'm much older than you. It's difficult to just say Nini. You'll hear people saying Osnini, Mama Nini. And why I'm mentioning that if you underestimate that in people's DNA, when they were brought up, that you need to have deference for the elderly and people who are senior positions. So she was sharing with me, then I come to company X, and then I'm respecting people who are older than me, who I report to. And then she got harassed, right? What she told us, I just saw that, you know, we need to be educated as well. She said, suddenly HR was just telling me, just report, you've got the right, you've got... She was battling with how she was brought up herself, that this person who harassed her is senior, very senior, both age and position. Now, you can, if you don't understand those nuances, and nobody is saying you must be complicit and all that, but listening and understanding where somebody's saying, I'm battling with this thing, is not a snapshot decision of me going to HR. So there is so much also that we need to be understanding that certain cultural you know, the teachings, I was brought up in a culture like that, but because I'm a practitioner in whatever, I've sort of gone through that way. But we sometimes think anybody can report, just go to HR. There's psychological no, they need to listen, to engage, to help people to go beyond those hurdles. And because gender equity is not just as easy, you know, it's both attitudinal, it's structural, it's systemic. And we often only push the attitudinal, that it's only about bias. And like Gavin is saying, the structures, the systems that support this anyway. If I was brought up like this, the whole structure, the whole system was designed in such a way that I'm fearful of coming across.
Thank you very much, Nene. I think that's such a potent point. In fact, so powerful that on Thursday, for those who are interested, there's a panel on gender and culture in which we'll unpack some of these points that you so beautifully articulated right now. We have another audience question. Gavin, I'm going to start with you. So do you have any views on sex and gender of change agent, let me start over. I did not read that correctly. Any views on whether the sex and gender of change agents, so I'm thinking this probably means sort of in the gender change process, influences the process of change. So women are often by default the implementers of gender change work, right? But this can collude with the view of some men that is not their work or that they need to step back. So in a nutshell, I think this question,
No, I mean, I've got a Christi, and I think the asker may collide with the view of some men that it's not their work. I think it's a very important question. You know, can men really be change agents, right? Can they really be trusted as change agents for gender equality change? And look, I can tell you personally, it's tough, right? It's really tough. There is a massive imposter syndrome that comes with that, right? A massive imposter syndrome. But it is necessary. It's a necessary, it actually creates friction. It creates friction in the company between the gender equality change maker that is male and other males in the organization. It's kind of like, hold on, not only are you feeling imposter syndrome because you're doing the work, but they're seeing you as an imposter to do the work, right? But I think it's a necessary friction, right? It's a necessary friction. If it is only women doing the work, we start thinking that this is a woman's problem, right? Versus this is actually a systemic problem that we need to resolve. So, this term allies, fine. I think we need to be stronger than that, right? It's not only an ally, it is actually a champion or a worker or a soldier, right? We talk about the League of Gender Equality Changemakers. We need the League to be gender inclusive itself in order for us to take it seriously. But an important, underscore there, what I'm saying is that it is a necessary friction to have in a company. Mm-hmm. Male workers on gender equality change, having the conversations with male workers that want to understand why they're working on gender equality change. It's a necessary friction.
Thanks so much, Gavin. I'm going to write that down and remember that term, necessary friction. Nene, before I go back to you, there's another question for you. So I'm going to ask you to sort of answer both of these together. Gabriella's saying, thanks so much for the rich conversation. I'm enjoying it. One of the pitfalls of doing this work can be resistance. And so she asks of Nene, what you said about the heart made me think about how institutions, especially those operating from male memory, can be intolerant of affect or emotion because it is still largely feminized. I know many fellow professionals, Black women especially, whose rage and other feelings are not listened to and or are dismissed. Where do we start when trying to identify and understand and mitigate resistance to gender transformation? And she says, thanks for sharing your insights.
I think for me, that links so much to what also Gavin has answered, because if we leave the work of gender equity to women, we are indirectly saying it is their problem and it is for them to solve. If you think about it, no, gender inequalities were not created by women. So it cannot be only solve yourselves, sort out this, because if, let's say, let me use the word sort out. If we are to sort out the problem, the whole organization benefits, the whole society. You're not only benefiting women, you're benefiting everybody. So it is everyone's responsibility. So if I go to the question around how do you also deal with resistance and the labeling, especially Black women, the labeling of Black women to say an angry Black woman, there's so many terms that are said, a shouting Black woman. This is where indeed you need change makers, also who are men who will stand up and actually talk against that. And Gavin is right. This is a necessary friction. It's an important friction, but it cannot be so fearful that you watching there to say, hey, as a man, because if I went to a march in Pretoria. We were going to union buildings at some point around gender-based violence. And some of the men were coming to join us and they're saying, what are you doing? Go back. And I was like, what? So you think this fight is only for us? I don't want to carry the ills of the whole country or the whole world on my shoulders because I'm a woman. This is a collective responsibility. So the issue of resistance, I'm better able to challenge somebody who looks like me, talks like me, than you would. So a male would also, we want those voices so that they challenge other men, so that the resistance that we are dealing with, and also for women to correcting ourselves, that perpetuating this narrative that women are difficult, women are this, it's like we are not helping the situation. So resistance for me needs to be approached from both sides. We need men who are activists. You're right, Gavin, for me, I don't just like saying ally, I want to say activists. We really have to be anti certain things, not just be, cushioning it. So I feel we need to work collectively together, but that is why there are terms that are called toxic allyship. Sometimes somebody comes to try and help, and what they are bringing is even more irritation. So as you are helping out, the need to hold up the mirror, all of us have to do our inner work while we are partnering to correct this, which we all benefit. It's not only women who are benefiting.
Thank you so much, Nene. And I think in a sense that speaks to, I think what might be our last question, I think this will be the last one before time runs out. And Torero asks, to the point of understanding and being brave and how unsettling confronting your own bias can be to both individuals and the organization. How do we manage the work environment and atmosphere while we're going through this process? I think that's a really good question, because as we just spoke about, you know, this can be quite an emotional process, I think.
Yeah, could I jump in there, Christi?
Of course, yes.
To what Nene and earlier Gabriella was saying. We talk about intersectionality, so just to add another friction, right? I am a male gender equality change maker that is also white.
Yes.
Right? How can I be trusted? Right? To lead this process, right? How can I even be in a room and not hear the rage that, you know, Gabriella was referring to? But, you know, the way that I look at it is, sometimes the best people to work with in solving the problems, and this is one of my heroes, Nelson Mandela, right? To work with in solving the problems are the problem themselves, right? So if we have men in the room, if we have white men in the room, we have, right? If we help them understand the root causes in their deep state and win them over to become champions and workers themselves, there is actually much deeper understanding of the problem and a much stronger workforce to go and solve the problem. So bring the problem in the room, change them, right? Change them and win them over. I think that this is, you know, this is important. And for any of you that are the men that are listening into this that want to do gender equality work, you know, be brave, park the imposter syndrome, and I assure you you'll be welcomed. Linking to Torero's question on, you know, how do we manage the work environment or the atmosphere as these conversations, as these conversations happen, and then also just back to that sticking in my head point from Gabriella around, how do we respect the rage and other feelings that are not being listened to, right? And, you know, to say, how do we do it in the workplace? Well, all we can do is talk about it and openly, and provide safe environments that we can talk about it and that we can address the discomfort as much as address the issue, right? You know, have conversations amongst colleagues, not only in formal environments, but have conversations and surface the discomfort. This is something that we would do in any friction point in an organization, right? We'd surface the discomfort, talk about it, and resolve it. And I think that is an important tactic for us to address, you know, awkwardness as we surface these things. Dismissing rage and other feelings. I don't want my deep state issues, you know, and my male memory. I thought that was brilliant. My male memory to you know, so take that as a given. I have male memory and I have deep state issues when I say this, but I don't believe that rage and other feelings in the work environment is going to win over colleagues and the organization. I am a deep believer in non-violent communication, especially in the workplace. There is a place for rage, and it is a necessary thing that needs to happen. It is a necessary thing that needs to be let out, right? Rage. But in the workplace, it's not going to result in change. It's going to result in more friction. So non-violent communication in the workplace will open up a whole lot more conversation than rage, even though I do believe the rage is necessary. You know, maybe my male memory says that rage in the workplace is not going to work. Non-violent communication will be better.
On Gavin, can I add on that? I agree with the because no human being wants to be approached like with, right? However, I want to add, however, on condition that for me, there are 3 roles that we often have to play. Let's say I am the recipient of this microaggression or discrimination, whatever. I have a role, okay, to engage and give you feedback and tell you that this is how this landed on me. You as the exhibitor, you have the role to own the impact of what you're. One of the problems is that people would say, but Nene, you know, I didn't mean it, you know, don't make life difficult. Own the impact of what you have said. You might not have intended it because intent and impact are different, but own the impact and be willing to listen. But there's another role, the role of the observer. The observer might not be the recipient or the cause of the thing, but he or she is the observer. Their role is to be upstanders, okay? Because we need to go by the principle that if you have seen it, if you have heard it, you own it. It doesn't have to happen to you. You've seen it, you've heard it, and we want to create a culture where we are saying this is inclusive and robust. An observer has a role, exhibitor of this behavior has a role, the recipient has a role. If all of us fold our sleeves and say, how can we work together? We will get somewhere. It's not about pointing fingers at each other. Collective work, and it can work if we are all committed.
Thank you so much, Nene. I think what I've really heard in these last couple of responses is the power and the impact of both listening, sort of communication both ways, right? And I think what I would add there, you know, is taking seriously how power influences how we hear, what we hear, how we speak, what we speak. We are sort of heading towards the end of the session. So to wrap up, Nene, Gavin, I'm going to give each of you sort of 1 minute to just share with us any thoughts that you think we may not have touched on, anything that you would like to leave the audience with.
Yes, for me, the one thing I want to really emphasize is that when we do this work, we must never underestimate the value of psychological safety, because this is the foundation that will help people to speak up. When we say just speak up is one thing. It's easier said than done. But my rank, my power, my privilege, if I have rank, power, and privilege, if I were to use Gavin, he's white, he's male, and he's senior as well, you have a lot of rank. So people with rank can actually use that to the advantage of what you want to create. If someone with rank becomes vulnerable and Gavin comes to a meeting to say, you know, yesterday Nene called me out because this is what I did. And you are indirectly communicating to people that it's okay to call out senior leaders because he's volunteering his vulnerability by saying you can call me out in any moment because we are trying to co-create this culture. So use of rank, and don't underestimate psychological safety.
Thank you so much, Nene. Gavin, you have 60 seconds to quickly share with us your last thoughts.
Christi, I don't need it. Wonderful conversation. I think having learned something on this call, Nene and Christi, thank you very much. There's some takeaways, 3 journeys. I love that. There was another three roles. I love that. And male memory. I'm going to carry those 3 things forward.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. So from my side, all that's left then is to say thank you so much. Nene, Molefi, Gavin, Krugel, this has been a fantastic conversation. I feel really privileged that I get to have this conversation with you on an ongoing basis because I think there's so much more to say. Thank you so much for having joined us. To the audience, thank you so much for your questions. Please join us again for the rest of this gender track, because I think we are on track to just have fantastic conversations. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you both.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.